When the war in Iran kicked off, a lot of people thought it would be bad for China. There was a widespread assumption that the war and any accompanying disruption to global energy markets would be bad news for the Chinese economy, given that China is the world's biggest energy importer and that it gets a lot of its oil and gas via the Strait of Hormuz, including something like 90% of all Iran's oil exports, which other countries generally avoid for fear of sanctions. Hawks in Washington also framed China as an integral part of what Republican Speaker Mike Johnson once described as an autocratic axis of evil, comprising China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea, and argued that a successful regime change operation in Iran would thus deprive China of a key ally. However, so far that's not how things have panned out. The Chinese economy has held up remarkably well. Trump has taken conspicuous pains to avoid upsetting Beijing, and the war, and the manner in which it's been prosecuted, has done real damage to America's global standing, especially with its allies. So in this video, we're going to explain why the war in Iran has been surprisingly good for China, and whether this will continue to be the case. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So perhaps the first thing to say is that the idea that an attack on Iran would represent some sort of strategic crisis for China has always felt a bit far-fetched, and the people who made this argument, usually ardent China hawks, have a habit of overstating China's dependence on Iran. It's true that the vast majority of Iran's oil exports go to China, and that, unlike most Western and Gulf countries, China has a functional diplomatic and economic relationship with Iran, which is why it is today Iran's biggest trading partner. However, while this might imply that Iran is quite dependent on China, it does not imply, and it is not the case, that China is therefore dependent on Iran. Because China just imports and consumes a massive amount of oil, and energy generally, Iranian oil only accounts for something like 10% of all Chinese imports, less than, say, Saudi Arabia, which usually accounts for something like 15%. Nor is it the case that China has some unique diplomatic relationship with Iran, as implied by the axis of evil rhetoric. Rather, China's foreign policy in the Middle East essentially involves maintaining cordial relations with as many countries as possible, and China has similarly friendly, if not closer, relations with countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which is why China has publicly criticised Iran's strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure and its plan to toll the Strait of Hormuz. Nonetheless, even if the war in Iran was never going to present some sort of strategic crisis for China, there were good reasons to expect it to hurt China's economy. After all, it's true that China imports most of its oil and gas, a lot of which usually comes via the Strait of Hormuz. There was thus a widespread expectation that disruption to flows through the strait would do damage to China's economy. However, again, that's not really how things have turned out, and China was actually able to avoid the sort of acute shortages we saw in other Asian economies. This was in part because, ironically, Iranian oil kept flowing through the strait until Trump's blockade earlier this week, and the CCP were able to slightly boost domestic production. But it was mainly because China was able to dip into its massive stockpiles. For context, beginning really in late 2024, China started building up a massive crude oil stockpile, and last year the CCP passed a new energy law mandating private refiners to hold stocks equivalent to at least 15 days of forward cover. In retrospect, this looks incredibly prescient, and it meant that, when the war kicked off, China had something like 1.3 billion barrels of crude, enough for about 3 months of demand, in reserve. This is also why China's partial ban on exports of refined products like diesel and gasoline worked surprisingly well. Bans on energy exports usually backfire because they just introduce friction into a complicated and globally interconnected energy market, but they're more feasible when your refiners are sitting on big stockpiles to begin with. Now, of course, while China might have been able to avoid any acute disruption, it has still, like everyone else, been hit by higher energy prices across the board. But this isn't as bad news for the Chinese economy as you might think, for 3 reasons. First, higher energy prices mean higher overall inflation, which is bad news for most economies, but actually sort of good news for China, which has been trying and failing to get out of a deflationary funk for the past couple of years. Year-on-year producer inflation, for instance, has been negative for more than 3 years, but finally ticked up to 0.5% in March, largely thanks to higher energy prices. Second, the Chinese economy is actually less exposed than you might expect to higher oil and gas prices. You can see this if you look at China's so-called oil intensity, which basically tells you how much oil the economy consumes to produce a dollar of GDP. China's oil intensity has fallen by an astonishing 80% since its peak in the 1980s, and China now has an oil intensity similar to that of the US, despite the fact that China is far poorer, and poorer countries generally have higher oil intensities, reflecting less efficient, more industry-heavy economic architectures. This is at least in part because China has made incredible progress on electrifying its economy. According to the latest data from 2024, for instance, electricity accounted for 24% of China's total energy consumption, up from about 7% in 1985, and more than either the US or the EU, with the gap almost definitely widening further in the 2 years since that data was collated. This was apparent in the latest GDP figures, published on Thursday, which showed that the Chinese economy grew by an impressive 5% year-on-year in the first quarter. Furthermore, in the longer term, the war-related disruption to global oil and gas markets will presumably increase demand for renewable technologies, where Chinese industry dominates. Third, the yuan has fared surprisingly well. For context, the war in Iran has been something of a double whammy for most oil-importing economies, who have seen both higher oil prices and sell-offs in their currencies and bonds, as investors flock to traditional safe havens. The surprising exception, however, has been China. The yuan has actually strengthened against the dollar, and Chinese bonds have outperformed even US treasuries, which have historically been seen as effectively the world's reserve bond. This both makes it easier for China to afford oil imports and gives the CCP the fiscal space to deal with any consequent crisis. You get the point. The Chinese economy has proved surprisingly resilient to the war in Iran. But perhaps the main reason this war has been good news for the CCP is that it's eroded American soft power to China's gain, as evidenced by international polling. Now, with stories like these filling the headlines, it's easy to be swept up in huge geopolitical and national security issues, and you might find yourself neglecting your own personal security. Your email is often overlooked when it comes to security, as you might think a couple of spam emails can't possibly be that harmful. But did you ever think about why your inbox is suddenly full of emails you don't want? That's because those big tech companies that are responsible for your emails aren't built to protect your inbox. They're built to sell your data. Thankfully, Proton Mail has your back. That's because Proton Mail offers one of the few genuine tools that protects users' personal information from being monetized or misused by those tech giants. They encrypt your emails, prevent surveillance from bad actors, and give you back control over your own communications. Proton has even made it so easy for you to switch from your old cluttered email with a tool that will make this possible to achieve in just a few clicks. Or you can just start fresh with a new email account and a clean mailbox from the beginning. But that's not all. They also offer a unique generational reset for you and your family. In today's society, even those born with complete anonymity can only stay private for so long. Children are now funneled into major tech ecosystems through school tools and apps that require specific accounts. And as soon as a child opens up a basic email account, their basic privacy is compromised, and big tech will instantly start to build an advertising profile without them even knowing. Thankfully, Proton Mail's Born Private campaign has an answer to that exact problem, as it offers you the opportunity to easily reserve an account for your child. You have the opportunity to protect their digital identity before profiling and tracking starts. So, if you want to take back your own privacy or protect the future privacy of your family, start using Proton Mail for free using our link at proton.me/bp/TLDR. And you'll be one step closer to a fully protected online experience free of data exploitation.